female owl was in the box with her young, and a southern flying squirrel appears in the opening looking into the box, and it looks in and it sees the owls. You can just hear it saying, "Oh crap, this is the wrong place," and it disappears. It like as fast as it could disappear, it was gone.
You are listening to Urban Wildlife Podcast.
Welcome back to another episode of the Urban Wildlife Podcast. We got your co-host, Billy Brown.
Tony Crosdale.
And we're here with
Rob Beauregard.
And we're drinking beer.
Cheers.
On Rob Beauregard's deck. Cheers.
Cheers. And we are...
Regarding beers.
And we're also... We're kind of staking out a screech owl nest box.
Yeah.
So this is the box that... I put that box up on a tree the year I moved into the Wynwood area, and a week after I put it up, I looked at I have a camera, there's a Nest Cam in it, and a week after I moved in, I looked and there was an owl had come in to check it out, and so they used it that winter, and we had the cams, we had live feeds, so we had the owl channel was broadcasting 24/7 on the TV in the house. And they raised 2 or 3 young that year. And so that was great fun. And then the next year, the squirrels moved into the box and filled it up with leaves. And then I moved it over onto the 4x4 post it's on now, but didn't really pay attention. And squirrels moved in and filled it up with leaves. And just this, late in the winter, I went up and cleaned all the squirrel leaves out of it, and I put aluminum flashing around the pole so squirrels can't get to it anymore. And that's why I put it on the pole, so that to keep squirrels out of it. And but I thought it was so late in the winter that I didn't think that the owls would use it this year. Then about 10 days ago, I was out in the yard, and I was down in the far corner of the yard in the morning, and I flushed a bird out of the trees down there, and it flew around and landed in some tall bushes over in the neighbor's yard, and all the chickadees and titmice started going crazy because it was the owl. So it was I figured, well, he's just roosting near here. And then later that afternoon, we were out in the yard. I looked up, and Mrs. Screech Owl was looking out of the box at me, and so she's got babies in there. So it's great fun.
So to set the scene, Rob lives in Wynwood, which is a near, so called an inner ring suburb of Philadelphia, and has got
literally 5 minutes from the city limits.
5 minutes from the city,
if that. Right?
And we're in his backyard, looks out on. What's the name of the stream?
This is the West Branch of Indian Creek.
All right, which is a tributary of
the Cobb's Creek,
near and dear to our hearts. So we've got sort of a nice little suburban habitat back here. It's a lot of fun.
And as we were saying earlier, we're joking on the way up. We're like, can we count this owl as an urban owl? And the thing we always talk about is Philly suburbs are other cities' residential neighborhoods.
Yes, like if this were Atlanta, this would just be in the city of Atlanta somewhere.
Yeah, or Charlotte.
It'd
be similar to right? Would this be similar to the?
This is
a residential neighborhood in Charlotte.
This is identical to a Charlotte suburb, and where I studied barred owls for 10 years with 4 graduate students. So suburban Charlotte has an enormous population of barred owls. Within 10 miles of downtown Charlotte, there are 300 pairs of barred owls nesting. And that's an estimate, but it's based on some pretty hard data. After our 10 years of studying the barred owls in suburban Charlotte, we know the habitat. They love to be near streams, just like Indian Creek here. They love to have big, tall trees, like the white oaks and sycamores in the yard here.
Yeah.
And
it's a great oak tree.
So they like a canopy. They like old growth forests, and that old growth forest is in quotes. So this, in fact, is, as far as the barred owl is concerned, this is old growth forest. So I was really surprised when I came up here. I really expected to see barred owls nesting in this suburban Philadelphia habitat, and I'm still somewhat shocked that they're not.
If you like the podcast and you're in Philadelphia, you don't just, podcasting's an audio medium, but you can also join us in the flesh. Tony and I on June 19th, the morning of June 19th.
Okay. We're discussing beer selection.
That's fine. Morning of June 19th.
I don't like IPAs.
Oh, really? Okay.
Tony and I are going to be, along with Robin, who's pitching in, Robin Frequent Podcasting guest host from the Tucony Frankfurt Watershed Partnership, long name. We're going to be doing a nature-focused ride sponsored by a local cycling magazine, Spoke, and Hidden City, which is a great Philadelphia website extraordinaire that pokes around the city and shows us neat things we never knew about Philadelphia. And so we're going to be doing a ride through the Tucony Creek Park in Philadelphia, and then popping out and going urban after that, and crossing.
But it is an urban park.
It is an urban park, and we're going to leave the park rather and go into sort of streetscape from there, and talk about what we see in streetscape areas. We're going to go to the northeast wastewater treatment plant, where we'll see the resident rough-winged swallows, which I saw, or whatever swallows are there now, but it's a neat.
It's most noted for a wintering population of swallows, but there should be some there still.
And then we're going to end up on the river, looking at some ospreys and whatever else we can find on the Delaware River. So it's going to be neat, like watershed park to streetscape near the channelized part of the stream, and then down to the river, seeing sort of the whole progression through North Philly. And so we're going to be leading the ride. It's not going to be too hard. I figure it'll be 10, 15 miles, most general trend downhill, street to street, so not riding too hard.
And I'll be riding my Salsa Warbird and carrying my optics in my Revelate frame and handlebar bags.
Those people better give us some money if you're dropping names like that.
I was just thinking that stuff is...
it's some badass birding cycling stuff.
Yeah, well, I mean, I'm sure other companies make similar bike. I think the Warbird is spectacular. But those bags, if you are into exploring places by bike, these bags made by Revelate that you can attach to your handlebars or your seat, it really dramatically increases the carrying capacity of your bike. And
I had some beer overflow right there. The foam surprised me. But carry on.
Yeah, I was just saying, it's really I love my touring bike, don't get me wrong, but it's steel and has racks, and it's nice to be able to take a much lighter bike out and still put some gear in it and still cover some distance and not feel too weighed down by your your normal touring bike.
At that time, I was at the University of North Carolina in Charlotte.
Okay.
And I arrived there in 93 and settled in the biology department as a visiting professor. And birds of prey have always been my passion. So I had a graduate student who was interested in doing some work with birds of prey, and I had I was also affiliated with the Carolina Raptor Center, which is one of the best raptor rehabilitation centers in the country. And I was on the board and participated with them, did a lot of things with them. So one of the things that I noticed that they were doing...
We're watching the mallard cruise past the deck right now.
So they're going up, they go sit underneath the bird feeder. And as the birds are feeding at the feeder and spilling stuff out, the mallards are there just sort of vacuuming up everything. So they actually are handy because they keep the area underneath the bird feeder clean. So that keeps my wife happy. So back to Charlotte. So my student wanted. So I noticed that the Raptor Center, when they brought orphaned owls in, would And sometimes owls are really orphaned. Sometimes people find them on the ground. They think they're orphaned, but they're really not. So I was concerned that when these owls, young owls, were being released by the Raptor Center without an allowance, without being provisioned by their parents as they were learning how to hunt, that they wouldn't survive. So I thought, well, this is a chance to do an experiment, and let's go and take some owls that are being released by the Raptor Center, and we'll put radio tags on the birds that are being released, and then we'll go find some owls that are being raised by their parents, and we'll compare the survivorship of the two. So my first student started with barn owls, not barred owls. And much to my surprise, he found that he did 10 bird orphans that were released by the Raptor Center. Just once they were fully feathered, they took them out in the wild and let them go and said, "You're on your own." And I thought 80% of those birds would be dead within 2 weeks. And it turned out that they were fine. They made it, and for as long as my student could follow those young, they did as well as the control group he did of young that were being followed. So that was a big surprise. And then, so we had a bunch of people building owl boxes because we were going to do barn owls, and then had this moment where I realized that barn owls are really rare around Charlotte, and barred owls, you can't swing a dead rat in suburban Charlotte without hitting a barred owl. And I thought, well, why are we thinking about studying barn owls when we're surrounded by barred owls? So we switched the project to barred owls and then began looking at barred owls in suburban habitats.
So from our viewers or listeners around the world who might not be familiar with these owls, barn owl is the labyrinth owl. It is the open country owl that often has in human structures that's kind of pale in color. And
it's a ghostly kind of
and has that heart-shaped face. And the barred owl they're roughly the same size. Maybe barred owl's a little bit bigger.
Yeah, a little bigger.
Yeah, and they're gray and
compared to
mottled.
the size of like a pigeon or a chicken.
I mean, they're like, barred owls are like 2 chickens.
Okay.
No, a barred owl would be a chicken.
About a chicken?
Yeah, it'd be 2 pigeons.
Okay.
3 pigeons, 1 chicken.
There you go.
And they're dark. That they have like the facial discs, not the heart-shaped face, and they don't have ear tufts, but they're a big chunky, a medium-sized chunky owl, I'd say, right? And,
so when you mentioned that the barn owls are ghostly, the reason that a lot of buildings are thought to be haunted is because barn owls make the weirdest, scariest noises you can imagine. So if you come up to an old abandoned house or a barn, and you come up there, and if there's a nest of barn owls in there, you're going to hear some scary noises. And you're going to say, "That's not a bird. I don't know what that is. That has to be a ghost." So ghost-like is a very appropriate.
I'm playing the Sibley app, so might as well give them. We're using their sound file. Might as well give them advertising.
Yeah.
The greatest bird app you can ever get. I highly recommend it.
Okay.
That's the barn owl. Sounds like a
Sounds
murder.
like a ghost.
Sounds like you're killing somebody. Yeah.
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 So if you ever need an excuse to call some old abandoned house haunted, that's it. So the mystery to us, why we looked at all these barred owls in Charlotte, and when you open up the book and you see read about barred owls, the first thing you read is that barred owls need large stands of old-growth forest to survive. Well, here I was in suburban Charlotte in this kind of habitat here in Wynwood.
That's
Lots
a big
of
white
trees.
oak tree we're looking at right now.
That is a giant white oak tree. And that's not a small sycamore. So what are all these birds? So the question was, and I sort of jokingly use this to introduce when I'm giving a talk about our barred owl research. I say, I open up with, barred owls supposedly need large stands of old-growth forest to survive. Well, here they are, 300 pairs in a 10-mile radius, within a 10-mile radius of downtown Charlotte. So either the book's wrong or barred owls can't read. So that's my sort of humorous, I think, lead into the talk. And so as I worked through the talk, I explained that, well, what do barred owls need? Why do they like old-growth forest? They like old-growth forest because they are a sit-and-wait predator. First of all, they need trees big enough to have cavities in them to nest in. Yeah. And they like an open understory because they're sit-and-wait predators. They'll go perch on a branch in the mid-story of the forest and just stand there. And they can turn their heads around. They can look at the entire world around them without moving. They can swing more than 360 degrees if you go sort of as far right as you can go to as far left as they can go. So they can see everything around them. They just sit there and wait. And then they see something start to move, and then they watch it for a while, and then they go down and grab it. So if you're in a young forest, not old growth, young forests, secondary growth forests tend to have a really dense understory. So if you're standing on a branch in the middle of that, looking down, all you see is dense brush growing up, and you can't see the forest floor. So you can't see your prey, and you don't have holes big enough to nest in, so that kind of forest is no good for you. So, big trees, open understory. What does an old suburban habitat have? It has big trees, and it has, the understory is mowed lawns and azalea bushes. It doesn't get any more open than that.
Yeah.
So one of the really cool things we found out with the
Housefinch.
Okay.
So one of the cool things we found out when we started studying the prey data, the prey habits, we put up a bunch of nest boxes, and we had 20 or 25 nest boxes that were used by barred owls each season, and we put video cameras in a bunch of them. And so what we saw was that the barred owls were in the city or the suburbs, were bringing in lots of birds. Over half of the prey items they were delivering to the nests were birds. And they were catching them at night when the birds were roosting in bushes. And it was so open that the birds had a hard time hiding from the owls. And so we also studied owls, the country owls, and we found they weren't catching nearly as many birds as the barred owls in the city or the burbs.
Well, you're saying city and burbs.
I mean,
Are you calling areas of the city limits of Charlotte suburbs because they're not? Are these within the city limits of Charlotte, or?
Yeah, well, the Charlotte city limits are kind of weird because they keep annexing the suburbs so they can increase their tax base. So we had great fun with the video cameras that we put in the barred owl nest boxes, and this is one of these another moment where we've been studying the barred owls, and we had them in boxes for 2 or 3 years before I realized that we should be putting cameras in the boxes to record what was going on. So we finally figured that out, and we got the technology all wired up, and so we had motion-activated video recorders on 10 boxes a year, pretty much. Some in the country, some in the suburbs, so we could compare the diets. So it was great fun watching those, and the cameras are mounted in the back of the box. We drill a hole in the back of the box so the camera is aimed right at the entrance. That way, when the male or female brings food in, you see her coming straight at you, and as it lands in the entrance to the box, you see whatever prey item is being delivered. So one of the funnier moments of all of the thousands of hours of tape we watched was a female owl was in the box with her young, and a southern flying squirrel appears in the opening looking into the box, and it looks in and it sees the owls, and you can just hear it saying, "Oh crap, this is the wrong place," and it disappears. Like as fast as it could disappear, it was gone. Because barred owls love to eat flying squirrels. And the one thing about barred owls is that they are very noisy. No one is surprised. You can never go up to a house and say, "Oh, did you know that there are barred owls nesting nearby?" because if they are around, everybody in the neighborhood knows about it. So one of the ways, we probably, half of the nests that we found in our studies in Charlotte, we would walk around with a boombox on our shoulder, broadcasting barred owl vocalizations. They go, "Whoo, whoo, 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 whoo. Who cooked for you? Who cooked for you all?" So we walk around, and that's one of that's the most common call. They've got another one that sounds like a monkey. It's called the monkey call. And I've had this, I was walking around a neighborhood with my boombox, broadcasting these calls, hoping that owls that were nesting nearby would come respond to the call and come in. Then we know that there was a pair nesting near there. So the little barred owl playlist was going through its cycle, and it got to the monkey call. And someone actually came up to me and asked me, "Did you lose your monkey?" So anyway, so we would be wandering around the neighborhoods of suburban Charlotte with our boombox, broadcasting owl calls at dusk, hoping to attract a breeding pair to respond, and so we would be able to locate their nest. And half of the nests that we found, someone would come up to us and say, "Oh, what are you doing?" I said, "Well, we're looking for owls." I said, "Well, there's a pair nesting 4 blocks over that way, or there's a pair over that way." Nobody is surprised to hear that there are barred owls nesting in their neighborhood, which is a little bit. So when I got here and I said, "Well, there's hardly any barred owls nesting here," it's not that they're nesting and people don't know about it, because if they're nesting, everybody in the neighborhood knows about it. They make so much noise. Woo, 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 woo.
Shall we talk about peregrine falcons in
Yes.
urban settings?
Perhaps the most urban of all raptors is the peregrine. It's a fascinating story,
Yeah.
the way this is all worked out.
And so the quick background is they were a casualty of DDT use in the mid 20th century, and they were broadly wiped out. And in PA we had historically 40 odd pairs, I think, nesting mostly on the cliffs along the Susquehanna
In the Delaware, yeah.
and the Delaware. So they like cliffs to nest on, and they were wiped out by DDT. They were reintroduced, and as they reintroduced them, the folks reintroducing them discovered that cities cities look like cliff habitat, and so a ledge on a building like City Hall looks like a cliff.
And to backtrack a little bit, to bring great horned owls back into the story, this is a nice little segue. When they first figured out what falconers, and I'm a falconer, so when falconers, so as they began to think, all right, we got to get falconers, pretty much were the ones who said, "Hey, there are no more peregrines here," because the falconers were going to the cliffs where they used to take a young out to fly for that year. They couldn't find any, and so as falconers said, "What's going on? Where are all the peregrines?" And they were sort of one of the first ones to raise a flag and say, "Something's going on here." So falconers sort of raised the flag, and then there were a few falconers. One named Bob Berry, who lived in Chester, up in Chester Springs, here, who was my mentor as a falconer. He was the one who pioneered captive breeding of birds of prey, which was an essential part of bringing the peregrine back. So once they got over, they figured out how to breed them in captivity. Yeah. Then the question was, all right, let's get them back where they used to be. So they went out to the sites where they used to nest and started releasing the young there, and all the young got eaten by great horned owls. And they said, well, this is no good. So let's go someplace where the great horned owls aren't. The first place they went was the Brigantine Marshes, because they figured, all right, we can get...
And this is in New Jersey.
In New Jersey, in Brigantine National Wildlife Refuge, right?
Legendary spot.
So we can go out there, and they went out and they put a big sort of giant birdhouse out. They mounted it on telephone poles, and it was far enough away from the woods that great horned owls wouldn't get out there. So they raised some peregrines, took some peregrines that had been born in captivity, put them in this big giant bird cage, as they were a couple of weeks short of being able to fly, and the falcons looked out at the world through basically jail cell bars, so they couldn't leave the nest before they were ready. And they were fed by the attendants at the site through a little tube in the back, so they didn't imprint on people. And then when they were ready to fly, they opened up the doors, and the birds flew around, and they were continually being fed by their foster parents, the humans at this release site. And then they imprinted on that site. And one of the cool stories about this is the second year they went out to that release site at Brigantine, they had the young in the nest. The young were screaming. They were young falcons, just like young humans are always hungry. And so they were screaming for food. Out of the blue, an adult peregrine arrived, and it was one of the birds that they had raised the year before. And it made it through its migration cycle. It landed on top of the box where it was born. It heard these young falcons screaming for food underneath it. It took off. It flew out, and when they saw it climb up and up and up, it went over a tern colony, rolled over, went into a stoop, killed a tern, brought it back, and stuffed it through the bars and said, "Eat this and shut up." That male falcon helped raise that brood of batch of young. So they realized, okay, this is cool. Let's do this where a city where great horned owls aren't. And the other place that great horned owls aren't is cities. And cities are full of steel and glass cliffs.
Well, cities isn't like downtown of cities.
Yeah.
Because we have obviously we have owl city limits. Yeah.
Sure. I didn't know you were so.
that's a big deal. So now there are 6-7 pairs of peregrines in Philadelphia. They're on the bridges. In New York City. They're on every bridge going in and out of New York City. They used to nest up on the Palisades, which are the cliffs on the Hudson River, and they would sort of commute from the Palisades to New York City to kill pigeons. The other thing about peregrines is that there's nothing they love to eat more than pigeons. That is it's a lot when you're training a peregrine. The pigeon meat is like a lollipop. So
do you have falcons now?
I don't. I did when I was a graduate in college and graduate school. I used to train and hunt with falcons, but they love pigeons. So the New York City peregrines used to commute from the Palisades to the city to catch pigeons, and they go back to their nests on the cliff. So they've since gotten into nesting on skyscrapers. Cathedrals are great, big churches, because they have lots of ledges and ornate little ledges where the peregrines can nest. 'Cause peregrines don't build no falcon builds its own nest. They only nest either in a cavity or on a ledge on a cliff where they'll sort of scrape out a depression. They don't carry sticks. They are in fact just like their close relatives, the parrots. This is a bizarre, but once you think about it, not so surprising result of DNA investigations of the familial relations of birds. It turns out that falcons are not at all closely related to hawks. They look like hawks because of a process called convergent evolution. Falcons are in fact very closely related to parrots. Their closest relatives in the bird family tree are parrots. Parrots nest in cavities, pretty much like falcons do. Falcon beak, when you look at it closely, looks a lot like a falcon beak. Did I say that right? Parrot beak looks like a falcon beak. Falcons manipulate things with their beak more than their feet. So when you're trapping hawks, a hawk's weapon is its feet, not its beak.
It kills with
its feet.
Yeah.
It attacks with its feet. It protects itself with its feet. So if you've trapped a lot of hawks, you learn early on that if you get the legs, you're safe. Because if you put your finger right next to its beak, it's going to bite you. But a hawk won't reach around aggressively with his beak to bite you. So if you're used to that, and I know I've done this, and a lot of people I know have had this experience, if you're used to catching hawks, you grab the feet, you're fine. You grab your first falcon, you grab its feet, and the falcon says, well, so what? And it reaches down and just starts wailing on you with its beak, because that's how a falcon kills its prey. Falcon grabs its prey with its feet, holds it down with its feet, and then reaches in with its beak, and it grabs the neck of whatever it's caught, and it twists. It has a little notch in its upper mandible that fits in between the neck vertebrae, grabs the neck, and twists, and that breaks the neck. So that's their weapon.
Yeah.
So the
It's supposed to
bird,
rip the head right off, right?
right? Yeah, if it's a little bird.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I found like a head of a yellow cuckoo downtown.
Yeah.
I assumed it was a falcon.
Yeah.
And I've seen lots of pigeon heads
Right,
downtown
yeah,
too.
So if there was
Next
if
time-
it was an aggressive twist, the head may come off.
Where do you see pigeon heads?
I mean, I haven't seen one. I don't think we've been recording a podcast, but in my
Okay.
life, I've noticed
Okay.
a fair amount.
So what we were doing, and we're going to explain a little bit about the process because the recording of Art actually, while he was talking, didn't come out so great. You'll hear some of it. We were recording, and Art McMorris, who is with the Pennsylvania Game Commission and an old birding buddy of Tony, or bird club buddy of Tony, and a biologist was sort of narrating what he was doing, but in the meantime, it was in an echoey room, and the falcons were screaming throughout the whole thing. So
It's the tower of City Hall.
it's in the city clock tower, and so I cut out some of the discussion. So we're going to talk a little bit right now about what they were actually doing. So the peregrines, they nest at City Hall. They nest at a lot of places, and he does this a lot of places. But at City Hall, they turned it into a media event, a great PR event, frankly, where they invite reporters and people like us to come in and help to watch. And in Tony's case, in my case, once to help out. I was the broom guy once. And when they're doing this, they're taking the fledgling or the what are they at that point? They're hatchlings. What's the right term? Nestlings. Taking the nestlings, and they're putting unique identifying bands on their legs so that in the future they can trace these falcons back to City Hall, where
They put a silver band, with a number, and then an information to call if you actually retrieve the bird in hand, and then they put in plastic bands that are color coded with numbers that you could read with binoculars.
right. And then they're also doing things like giving them basically a health exam, seeing what kind of diseases they might have that they might be able to treat, seeing what kind of parasites they might have on them that they do treat with. They dust them with the powder that kills biting flies and lice, I guess, and
Yeah.
sort of ectoparasites.
Ectoparasites, yeah.
And some other background, the falcons, this is at about 21 days. I guess their legs have reached the size they're going to get to so that they know the bands will fit okay. And in another 20 days, they'll be flying. So actually, that's about the summary stuff I wanted to do. Now we're going to...
This is from last year. I just went and did it again this year.
Yeah.
But this time I went officially as a Philadelphia Parks and Rec employee,
That's a good point.
and I got to meet the mayor. I got to meet my boss.
That is awesome.
The
I'll say the mayor shows up. Mayor Kenny shows up.
Yeah.
I've seen him show up at a lot of stuff for my work. And I did the Falcon thing a few years ago when I was writing for Grid. And I was happy. It was a lot of fun because the game commission officer, Jerry, I think,
Yeah.
hadn't shown up or was caught in traffic on the Schuylkill Expressway. And so I was there, and they're like, we need someone to be the broom guy. And I was like looking around at all these birders who were there with their binoculars and their cameras, and they're all just like shook their heads. They didn't want to do it. I'm like, what are you talking about? Like, we need someone to go out there with the broom and guard the Art as he goes into the box to take out the nestlings. And I'm like, I'm on it.
Yeah. I was a broom. I brought
It's a fun job.
This high school has a requirement the students have to do like an internship for 2 weeks, and it was like, and so
You brought the intern out as a broom guy?
Art was like head in the broom.
That's awesome.
So it was me and an intern from high school, I was actually like looking at, for some reason I don't know why I was looking at Art first, and I should have been turned around, and the falcon came and whacked me right in the hard hat. It was
So
awesome.
they give you like a construction hat and a broom and goggles, and you stand out there as the falcons come in and dive on the guys who are taking their babies out of their nests. You're supposed to block it with the broom.
So in osprey work, it's the oar guy. So you paddle,
You paddle out there.
you paddle out to with your canoe, and there's some birds that are so aggressive that you need an oar. Somebody has to hold an oar over your head. So Google barred owl attacks, and you'll see me getting whacked by when I was going into barred owl nests, I had to have a lacrosse helmet. And I've got a picture. I put little owl decals, stickers on every time I got hit by an owl. I would get hit. I got hit one time 7 times in one nest visit.
Wow.
And this is a 2-pound owl that's coming in. It's pissed off, and it hits you hard. And I went up a couple of times. When I first started this, I didn't know about needing helmets. So early on, it dawned on us early on that the helmets were required. So my graduate students got me a little hard hat, like a construction hard hat. And they put a little target on the back of it. Well, that's no good because it sits up too high on your head, and the back of your neck is just such a good target. So I found someone who had a lacrosse helmet and used that. And you really need the full face mask because the barred owls will come in. They'll never hit you if you're looking at them. So they'll either hit you in the back, or they'll come at you and they'll keep the tree in between you and them until the last minute. And they'll swerve around a tree and get you sort of a rake. So I get hit on the shoulders a lot. And there's a famous wildlife photographer in Europe who lost an eye.
Wow.
Oh my God.
To the European version of the barred owl because it whipped around the tree and got him in the eye.
The tawny owl?
Yeah. And so he wrote a book, and the name of his book was An Eye for Birds.
Wow.
And I'll just tawny owl real quick. We're gonna hit him later on in the season. When I talked to a birder in London about I think it was tawny owls eating exotic parakeets in London.
Wow.
But we'll get to that later. So, this is Billy.
I'm Tony.
And so we're standing in the clock tower of City Hall, which is kind of like a bare brick interior with elevator, like old wire and metal elevator shaft in the middle. We've got a folding table with a moving padding blanket on top of it with some hard hats.
And then pliers and a small tackle box full of bird bands.
And with a whole lot of reporters, and we're getting ready for the peregrine banding here at City Hall.
And there are, of course, Pennsylvania Game Commission officers, and the peregrine falcon coordinator for the state is here, who's also a member of my bird club and an awesome dude.
There you go.
The reason we're banding these is not because it's a hobby and not because we like to pick up the birds and say, see how cute they are. The only reason we're doing this is to help the population to recover. The population is still recovering in the East after they were completely wiped out by DDT. And banding is our most important tool for being able to keep track of the population as it recovers. So by banding the birds and then identifying them later on, we can tell how long they live. We can find out where they go. We can find out whether they nest successfully and expand the population. We can find out where the peregrine falcons that are nesting here today come from. Because of the bands, we know that the female here hatched on a tower at Tuckahoe River, New Jersey in 2006.
So she's banned.
She is banded. The male is also banded, but that doesn't help us. He was banded. I banded him here in Philadelphia as an adult. He actually got trapped in a building downtown during nesting season. The building owner called us up, caught him, examined him, made sure that he was healthy, he was uninjured. And before I released him, I banded him, and I didn't know where he came from. I didn't know that he was a nesting male here, but a few weeks later, when I came here to band the young, I read his band number. I said, holy cow. When he got caught in that building, his mate was incubating 4 eggs. If we hadn't got him and released him quickly, she would have abandoned the nest and the nest would have been. So it was a very lucky thing. So although he's banded, we don't know where he's from.
I'm Don Perlman, and I'm an attorney in Philadelphia, and I'm a day-to-day observer of the falcons, the peregrine falcon. I'll tell you what happened. We moved into 1 South Broad Street.
Yeah.
And we're on the 23rd floor, and it's a tremendous building with great management.
Yeah.
And they built a terrace on the roof right outside us.
Yeah.
And so we figured it'd be great to use the terrace for lunch and everything like that. But it turned out that the terrace was directly across from the nest box and directly across from the Ritz Hotel. But the falcons will be in the nest box when the chicks are born, when the chicks are hatched, and then while they're developing before they start to fly. But they spend a lot of time on the Ritz Hotel directly across from us.
Cool.
And so we just started taking pictures of them, and eventually got to the point where it was so much fun that we were just doing it all the time.
Yeah.
And I mean, I easily could have a day where I take 500 pictures because of our proximity. You get to see it doing a little bit of everything. You get to see the eggs hatch. You get to see the chicks moving around, and I mean, you see day-to-day development. And if you take pictures every day, you can see every day they're a little bit bigger. And that's if I didn't have the proximity where I could see them when they're sitting on a roost, watching all around, seeing when they take off after pigeons, seeing when they're mating, and you know, I mean, that's what's interesting.
Yeah.
So it isn't the birds per se; it's the ability to watch them and sort of their, you know, just everyday activity.
So right now, they're going out onto the ledge to check the nest box, and the adults are diving on them. So the biologist is out on the ledge, scooping them out of the nest, and people are sort of ferrying them in mesh bags as they come out, and looking at one of them perched up on the top of a column. I can't remember if it's ionic or Doric, ionic or what, but a column, and she's screaming at everybody. And the other one is taking a turn, sort of flying out and then swooping back in. So Tony, what you got there?
American falcon chick.
Yeah, thanks.
Okay, so this is bird number 1. And bird number 1 is 785 grams. 785. And at age 21 days, I know that a bird of that weight is a female. And I knew she was a female just by looking at her in the nest box. Because besides being larger than the males in body size, females have legs and feet that, in proportion to their body, are larger than the males. So that means that when they grow up the rest of the way and they start flying, the females will be able to take larger prey than the males. The males, on the other hand, are more maneuverable and more nimble in the air. So it's really sharing the duties of hunting. Very effective.
We were just talking about how badass these birds look, and right now we're looking out the window at, I don't know if it's a female?
Yeah, I believe so. It looks really burly.
A burly looking falcon, but the things, like the head markings look kind of like war paint or something, and she's looking in here like she's going to kill everyone in here as soon as she gets a chance.
Yeah, they have that counter shading with like the dark on top, light on the bottom. They really look like a fighter jet. I mean, and that's what they are. I mean, they take prey in the air like an F-15 or something. And no wonder they called the F-22 the Raptor.
She's mad. Understandably. She's every good reason to be mad. But
It's amazing how much these adult peregrine falcons weigh only about a pound. I mean, only about 2 pounds, but they just look so much more heavy and powerful than that.
yeah, cool. Tony's out there on the ledge with the box of babies. Or relaying them. one of the things I liked about it was just the public nature of it. I mean, in sort of turning. It's funny. Other times I've crossed. I remember I was crossing to City Hall for work, and was with people, and I'm like, look, right there is a peregrine falcon, and like I don't think people, when you're in a city, people don't look up.
Yeah.
When we go to the Manayunk and sit at
Manayunk is a neighborhood of Philadelphia.
Manayunk, so there is a pair of peregrine falcons that have been nesting for 4 or 5 years in a church steeple in downtown Manayunk. And we go in the first week in June, and when the young falcons have started to fly around, and we go to the Couch Tomato pizzeria, beer hall, and go out on their sidewalk tables and set up our scopes and eat. It's peregrine and pizza night. And we sit there with our scopes, and the young peregrines are screaming around, begging for food. For a birder, you arrive there, and that's all you hear is peregrines. And you look up, and there's 3 or 4 young peregrines flying around, chasing their parents, telling them to go out and get me more food. And
more pigeons.
We need more pigeons. So you set up your scopes, and people come over and say, "Well, what are you looking at?" And these peregrines that are screaming over your heads that you almost have to talk loudly to speak over, and you haven't noticed them. You go like, how could you not hear and see these birds that are flying over your heads? So everybody, and there's a bar across the street. So everybody from that bar comes over and looks through our scopes, and everybody that's on the sidewalk, the Couch Tomato sidewalk, comes and looks through our scopes, and we tell them about the peregrines, and it's a great evening. And the waiters over at the restaurant, waiters at both places now know us, and they say, "Oh yeah, the peregrine guys are here again." And so it's a great evening, and it's always a good show because the young falcons are flying around, and they're not good enough to catch food for themselves yet, so they're dependent on mom and dad. If they're hungry and mom and dad perch and stop, the young will just dive at them and say, "Go get me some food."
There, something I wanted to touch on. You often usually for the podcast, we pick the synanthropic organism of the podcast, and so this is a term that refers to animals or plants that sort of occupy the habitats we create, live with us, and synanthropic. And so, for example, pigeons, or whatever you call them, Eurasian rock doves, whatever, are sort of a classic one where it's hard to quite figure out the difference between wild and domestic and feral. Like it's sort of all one big muddled mass of pigeon, whether that's in Europe where they might have been from, or in New York City or Philadelphia, or any other city. I've seen them in cities in Mexico and South America. And so I thought for sort of a point of discussion, like now we've got peregrine falcons that are coming back in Pennsylvania, but
all over the East Coast.
But so many of their sites are urban sites where and this is something Art pointed out when I was talking to him. I didn't get it on tape, but that their survival rates in cities are similar to non-urban areas, but they require more rescuing. So a fledgling might sort of get hit by a car or something and need to get rescued by a volunteer or something like that. But so they sort of they fledge and survive with human assistance. They nest maybe in places they find on their own, but also in sort of ledges and boxes that are kind of set up by humans.
Yeah.
They eat pigeons. They eat sort of a feral animal that lives in association with us. They sort of reach this sort of blurred status of wild and sort of wild in our cities, and they're nesting on our structures. And so I was going to nominate them for for maybe problematic a little bit, but kind of the synanthropic organism of the episode.
Well, they're going to be one eventually. They're going to evolve into one because in the East, the East subspecies of the eastern subspecies of the peregrine falcon is gone. The falcons out east now they're I'm sure you could elaborate on this more, but they're a bunch of zoo and falconer birds and birds we got from the west and the Arctic all mixed together. So now they're like this.
I think there are 6 or 7 subspecies that have been. So the gene pool of the falcons that have been introduced in east of the Mississippi are a mix of 6 or 7 subspecies. And there were purists who said, oh, you shouldn't do that. And there were people who did not want peregrines to be reintroduced because they were this genetic hodgepodge, sort of a chimera of different subspecies. And I think that's silly. So what we did was we effectively took a bunch of peregrine genes, put them together in a whirring blender of captive breeding, let them go, and said, okay, some of these genes are going to work and some of them won't, and let's see what comes out the other end. And so what survives will be, first of all, the genes that enable peregrines to somehow calm down enough to be bred in captivity.
Sure.
And then the genes that enabled them to fit with the prey species they were encountering. And peregrines are adaptable enough in terms of the prey they can catch. That wasn't a big issue. But I think maybe there was a little genetic filter that went through that the peregrines that were calm enough to accept captivity and be bred in captivity, those genes made it through, and now they'll spread out, and they're the ones that will make it, and they're spreading out into cliffs, into more. They're moving away from some of them are moving away from the cities.
Art was saying that they're still primarily nesting in man-made structures, though.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah, and there's a strong cultural factor in you nest where you look for a nest like you grew up in. And this is probably happening in ospreys too. Where ospreys, right now, 95% of the ospreys nesting between New York and Boston are on man-made structures. And that percentage is pretty similar wherever you go. So right now, when an osprey nests in a tree, it's sort of like a big event. It's sort of a man bites dog story. When an osprey nests in a tree, oh my God, it's big news. So a lot of that, I think, is this sort of a cultural thing. If you look for a nest site where you were raised. So to some extent, the peregrines and ospreys are now very deeply entwined with our species.
Synanthropic organism.
So we're going to listen now to Jesslina Suri, who I found just on Twitter because she was commenting on what kind of owl was this? An owl outside of her house in Cape Town that was calling at night.
Was it the Cape Eagle Owl?
I forget, but I messaged her and I said, "Hey, can you record that?" And then it was sort of like a by the way thing. I was like, "By the way, what do you do?" Because she was posting other stuff that she was looking at, or that she was talking. She was posting other things that she was doing, and then I found out she was a spotted eagle owl. She's a neighborhood spotted eagle owl, and then she was doing research on something I'd never heard of before, black sparrowhawk. And so we're going to stop and listen to her for a minute, and then talk a little bit about that and the question of urban habitats as, because I know Rob has researched this or talked about it before last time we interviewed him, about urban habitats as sources versus sinks for urban birds of prey.
Hey guys, thanks for having me. I'm Jesslina Suri. I've just finished a master's degree in conservation biology at the University of Cape Town in South Africa. My master's research looked at black sparrowhawks in Cape Town, specifically looking at the impacts of urbanization on their health and diet. I've recently become really interested in urban ecology, but I also happen to be a really avid bird watcher. So over the last couple of years, I've managed to kind of combine these interests in my research projects, and I've been studying urban birds. So for my honours research, I was looking at the impact of urban rivers on bird diversity, and I really enjoyed that. So for my master's, when we had to choose our projects, I knew that I wanted to do something similar. And then I got really lucky when my supervisors approached me one day. I was just having a drink at the university pub, and then they came and asked me if I wanted to do this project. Then they sent me a proposal, and I basically thought, it's raptors and it's urbanization, so definitely yes. The black sparrowhawk belongs to the genus Accipiter. Accipiters are basically a group of raptors that consist of goshawks and other sparrowhawks, and most of them are forest-dwelling raptors that prey on other birds, with larger species generally eating things like pigeons, doves, and game birds. In Africa, black sparrowhawks are the largest accipiter. Their range was generally traditionally in the forested areas of East Africa and West Africa, and then parts of Southern Africa, but then recently, particularly in South Africa, their range has been expanding. So while they used to only be in natural Afromontane or riparian forests, because humans have been planting pine and eucalyptus trees and other exotic trees everywhere, their range has now expanded also as a result of that. So, for example, in Cape Town, they never actually used to occur here, but since around the 80s, I guess, their population has grown, and now we have over 50 breeding pairs in the area, as well as a number of non-breeding residents, so their population has really grown. But now what's also happened as a result of their range expansion is that while they used to occur in natural areas, they've now been exposed to these urban and human-dominated landscapes. Now, there are some benefits which come with this, because they've now got these prime nesting habitats in pine and gum trees, and they've also got this abundant supply of food because there's pigeons and doves everywhere. But there may also be some negative consequences, because urban areas can obviously come with their own threats, like, for example, pollution, disturbance, diseases. So the main idea behind this project was to look at the trade-offs that come with living in a city. Are they really just thriving here, or are they falling into this ecological trap where you've got this habitat that looks really attractive, but it's actually having hidden consequences on their long-term health and survival? So in terms of the design of the project, you can kind of think of there being two elements to it. The one part was the health and the other was the diet, and then we tested both of these things along an urban gradient, so to see if they differed along a gradient of increasing urban cover within the territory surrounding the nest. Last year we only sampled about 30 chicks, but with the previous years combined we actually had a sample of about 300 chicks, so we actually had quite a lot to work with. And the reason that we looked at only chicks and not adults was partially because we didn't have enough samples from adults. They're much harder to capture, but also because at that stage of their life, the chick is confined to the nest, so it's more exposed to the conditions of the surrounding environment than an adult would be. For the diet stuff, we looked at two things. Firstly, we looked at the actual diet composition, and for that we had hundreds and hundreds of prey remain samples. Basically what this means is that black sparrowhawks often discard the feathers and the bones of their prey around the nest, so you can kind of scan the area surrounding the nest and find a lot of bones, and we were able to collect these. And then it's quite straightforward identifying those feathers and bones down to species level. So then we did that, and then we also looked at the actual abundance of prey to get an idea of prey availability in different habitats, and this was basically just doing bird counts in different areas around the nests. In terms of health, it was actually pretty amazing because for each of the indices that we looked at, we actually found no effect of increasing urbanization. So there were no health consequences to living in a more urban territory, which was just amazing. The only significant trend that we found was actually a positive one, whereby the infection by one of the parasites that we looked at actually decreased in urban areas. So we were really surprised by this. And we suspect that the reason for this particular trend might be that this particular parasite is transmitted by black flies, which require running water as their breeding habitat. And it may be that the lack of this kind of aquatic habitat in urban areas may actually just decrease the abundance of this parasite, and that might be something that black sparrowhawks are taking advantage of. In terms of the diet, we found that pigeons and doves made up 87% of their diet, and that's including 5 different species of pigeon and dove. Particularly their favorite one is the red-eyed dove, which makes up 42% of their diet. And then the rest of the things that they ate included things like helmeted guinea fowls, spotted thick-knees, starlings, and even other raptors, which was also really cool to find. The 2 raptors that we found were the African goshawk and a smaller species of sparrowhawk. And then there were a few records of odd things like lapwings and ibises, people's chickens, and then the odd squirrel and mole rat too, which was actually unexpected because we thought that they were strictly bird-eating raptors. So we tried to see if the degree to which each of these species featured in their diet varied with increasing urbanization, and we expected maybe that pigeons would be more commonly eaten in more urban habitats or more urban territories, but we didn't find any of these trends. And then we also expected that maybe the variety of their diet would decrease in urban areas because in more urban areas where, say, pigeons once again are more abundant and there's a lower diversity of species, you would have a corresponding lower diversity of species in their diet. But yeah, again, we didn't find any trends like that. Because in some cases, while there were species that were more common in urban habitats, overall, all the species were pretty well spread out across different habitat types. And this basically just shows that all habitats contain enough prey for black sparrowhawks. And yeah, this explains why we didn't see any trends in the diet composition. Then to kind of link the health and the diet aspects, we hypothesized that maybe the lack of any negative impacts on health is because there's prey available everywhere in urban areas, and clearly black sparrowhawks aren't under any kind of nutritional stress. We also thought that maybe it's actually just the nature of the city of Cape Town and the way that the urban gradient is spread out is not as straightforward as we kind of made out. It's not as simple as just measuring a gradient of urbanization. It may just be that the fact that Cape Town contains so much patchy, suitable habitat is enough to kind of mask the effect of that urban gradient, and that might be why we didn't find any of the significant trends that we expected in many cases. But yeah, putting that all together, we were actually really amazed to find that black sparrowhawks are so robust, and that, I mean, clearly they're just thriving in the environment of Cape Town. And it may be that this has a lot of significant implications for other bird-eating raptors like the black sparrowhawk. So for example, I mean, we've seen the same thing with peregrine falcons. It may just be that birds like these actually thrive in urban environments, and that's a pretty significant finding because ecologically raptors play a really important role. But also, I mean, there's this whole kind of train of thought that urban wildlife influences the way that people experience urban environments, and I mean, it's pretty cool having raptors like that in an urban area. Or maybe I'm biased, but I think it's pretty cool having so many raptors in an urban area. In theory, it's easy to tell apart a pigeon and dove bone by the size, but sometimes it wasn't as easy as seemed, and I just didn't know what I was looking at, and it wasn't very pleasant work to do either, because I would just be sitting in front of smelly bones for hours and wondering what I was doing. But the crazy thing is that by the end of it, I actually kind of ended up enjoying it. It kind of felt like detective work, and it was exciting. So now I actually find myself getting excited about bones and roadkill and trying to figure out what they are. So yeah, I guess I'll never ever be the same, but at least I've added to my skill set. As for working in busy urban areas, it's definitely more exciting than people would think. For example, the nests that we were working at would often be at these parks where people would run and walk their dogs. So we often ended up attracting a lot of bystanders who were wondering what we were doing, because they'd see us setting up around this guy who's climbing a huge pine tree, and we had all this equipment with us. Yeah, there were a few occasions where it actually got a bit chaotic, because occasionally when Mark, our climber, was up at the nest, the female sparrowhawk would get quite agitated once he got closer to the nest, and we had one occasion where the bird was quite aggressive and she kept making quite close flybys and passes at him. Meanwhile, we were all at the bottom trying to process the chicks and return them to the nest as quickly as possible, and there was a bit of a crowd gathering around us, and they were all watching this bird passing at him, and there were dogs around, and they were sniffing around and trying to steal my blood samples, so it occasionally got a bit stressful like that, but yeah, luckily that was as crazy as it got. Then also with the prey remains, I would spend quite a lot of time travelling around the city with a cooler box filled with samples, and occasionally people would look at me funny on the bus, so they would ask me what was in the box, and I would tell them there were bird bones in there, and I would get even weirder looks. So that was a fun period of my life. And then I think the most common kind of issue that I faced was while doing the bird counts. It's amazing how quickly people get suspicious when they see you loitering around with binoculars in the suburbs. So yeah, the number of times that people approached me and asked me what I was doing there, I lost count. So yeah, there's quite a lot of excitement in urban research.
A lot of what you were saying reminded me. These birds are doing quite well in the urban area because they're eating the birds that are in the urban suburban areas, and also a lot of walking. The interactions with the residents seem to be kind of reminiscent of what you were talking about too. People being a curiosity.
Sure. For some species of raptors, it's very obvious that they're in your neighborhood. The sparrowhawks over in South Africa, they might be a little more secretive. I think people would be surprised at how many Cooper's hawks are in the suburban area around Philadelphia. But
they're like in backyards in West Philly. I see them in South Philly.
I saw some hunting pigeons above the Sunoco on Walnut Street in West Philly.
Yeah.
So some species are pretty sneaky and cryptic, and others, like the owls, are very obvious. But that there's a clear theme here and this is true not only of raptors, but coyotes are invading suburbia, and crows. 50 years ago, you couldn't find a crow in a suburban habitat because they were all shot, and we've stopped shooting crows, so they're smart enough to figure that out, and so they're now everywhere. So there's a lot of wildlife that has adapted to and invaded the suburban habitats, and one of the questions that raises is, are these suburban habitats productive areas for the wildlife that's moving into them? So in conservation biology, there's a bit of jargon where we talk about source and sink populations. We talk about ecological traps, and I think the gal there who was talking about the sparrowhawks mentioned ecological traps. So some habitats are really good, and a species can move into it, and they can produce a lot of young, and they're producing more young than enough young to take care of or compensate for the adult mortality, to the extent that they're actually exporting offspring. Offspring are looking for places to breed, but there aren't any available, so they're moving out to other patches of habitat. So that's a population that a conservation biologist would call a source. The owl may be down there with all of that chirping that's going on there. Maybe one of our screech owls is down there.
Freaking out the local songbirds.
Right. So some populations, if they're really productive and they're pumping out enough young that they can populate nearby areas, are what we call a source population. Then there are situations where a species, individuals of a species, move into a habitat that looks good to them, but there's something wrong with it that they can't tell. For neotropical migrants, it could be a small patch of forest that's so small that the cowbirds are everywhere, and they sort of check off all of their little boxes in their real estate searching list, and they say, this looks perfect for me, but what they don't know is that they're so close to a forest edge that every time they build a nest, it's going to be full of cowbird eggs, so they're not raising any young. It might be a situation where there are so many feral cats that the habitat looks good, but they're getting wiped out by the feral cats. It might be a situation where there's a pesticide or some pollutant in that patch of woods. Or, in the case of my barred owls, it may be a patch of forest that is not very good, but it's the best they can do, so they're going to nest there anyway, and they wind up not being very productive. So they can't produce enough young to fill in, compensate for the adults that are dying off every year through natural mortality. So that situation is what we call a sink. So birds are nesting there.
So you found the suburbs of in North Carolina to be a sink for...
No, it was a source.
Oh, it was a source. Okay.
So that was one of the questions. When we started that project with barred owls, we wondered, is this a source or a sink? Because the reason we knew there were so many barred owls was, one, we heard them in our neighborhoods, but the barred owls were coming in, a lot of barred owls were coming into the Carolina Raptor Center. And most of them were car collisions. So it might have been the situation where the owls were reproducing a lot of young, but not enough of them were surviving to replace the adults. Well, it turned out that the suburban habitat for barred owls was very productive, and there is a very high mortality rate, but there are enough young produced that there's never a habitat vacancy.
Jess I'd asked her about the source sink question, and she had mentioned that it's hard to call it Cape Town anything but a sink just because it's a new population that has moved into the city. Mm-hmm. But it's a question that remains to be seen over time. Whether
definitely an owl down there.
Yeah.
So what we're noticing is that we're hearing a whole lot of songbird.
The local robins are pissed off.
That's something. So now Tony's stalking it with the binoculars.
And it's an owl.
Where's it likely to be perched?
Well, it's in the brush across the creek, probably.
If you're listening to this podcast, we're going to bet that you love nature, you love wildlife, you're in a city, and you probably have a smartphone that you can use to tape something. So next time you see something, let's say something cool, but something cool that, like, even if it's routine, something cool. If it's the fox squirrel in Indianapolis near where you are, if it's the invasive fox squirrel in Los Angeles, if it is the
Eurasian eagle owl that nests in your football stadium that attacks the players on the field.
That would be awesome.
Look it up on YouTube. It's awesome.
If it's a local powerful owl that's picking off the possums in your Australian neighborhood, any of those things, drop us an audio snippet, or if you want to give us a phone call, you can call us in the United States. It's 267-603-3219.
Wildlife bling?
267-603-3219. And or record it on your phone and pop it over to us. You can email us at urbanwildlifecast@gmail.com, or you can hit us up on Twitter at urbwildlifecast, or find us on Facebook. and let us know what you're checking out. And I'm not sure what we're going to do next week. We're probably going to do something about cemeteries. We're going to be doing a recording at the Woodland Cemetery, a great urban Philadelphian cemetery. Talk about some of their stuff and also about cemetery stuff around the world, actually. And again, if you're in Philadelphia and you want to join me and Tony on a bicycle ride, there's going to be a fee. It's $10 if you're already part of Hidden City, $15 for general public. But it's sponsored by the magazine Spoke and the Hidden City Project, and the series called Bike Exploration. Tony and I, along with our buddy Robin, we're going to be checking out the Tacony Creek watershed, from the park itself down to some interesting, very urban, urban industrial and post-industrial stuff, all the way down to the Delaware River to look at some ospreys and whatnot along the river. You can join us and get a nice in-person urban wildlife cast experience.
Indeed.
All right, we want to thank Rob for hosting us on his patio.
It was a pleasure.
And we're all sort of peering around trying to find this owl that's freaking out all the birds. And
We know it's there.
Hey, podcast listeners. Here is a recording from Sean Hayes in Dallas, Texas.
I'm out herping in southeast Dallas in the Trinity River bottomlands and just off of Loop 12. And the river's recently flooded, so that's pushed a lot of the snakes and other animals really up against the walking paths, which are on higher ground. So I was walking through tall grass on the edge of the flooded deciduous woods and just came across this beautiful adult copperhead just coiled up in the grass, which of course requires careful watching. And it is a southern copperhead. It has the hourglass pattern, a very beautiful kind of a normal pattern, and it's motionless even though I'm standing here right over it, coiled up and just trying to stay dry. So I've seen several water snakes that darted into the water just as quickly as they felt me approaching, so this is the first one I've been able to corner, so to say. And what I'm going to do is just take a few photos and then we'll move on and see what else we can find as we walk along the edge of the flooded river. That's the sound of I believe the eastern narrowmouth toad. I'm not as good with frogs as I am with snakes, but find the narrowmouths every once in a while. I usually find them in dry areas, but curiously they can be found here near the Trinity River. So right now I'm on top of a very steep bank going down to really the woods, which have become a swamp because of the river that's flooded them. I just broke a branch on my way down. And this is the kind of habitat that broad-banded water snakes like to live in. They're not a common water snake in north central Texas in the Dallas-Fort Worth area, but the corridor along the Trinity River and some of the swampier areas, you will find them, including all the way up to Louisville. So that's kind of my target species for now because I haven't found very many of them and have not seen one confirmed yet. It could have been any number of the water snakes that slipped in the water before I had a chance to identify them. Okay, now I'm looking at a juvenile 5-line skink. It could be a broadheaded, I can't confirm, and it's sunning on a tree with just a little bit of sunlight coming through the trees on top of this branch that juts straight out at a low height from the base of the tree. And yeah, he sees me now. He's going to scurry off. It's the most common large skink in this area. That's the sound of Blanchard's cricket frog. as we get closer to evening, the frogs are really coming to life out here.
The great horned owls, the people ask me what great horned owls eat, I say whatever they want to. And when people ask me where they nest, I say wherever they want to, because there's nothing bigger and badder than a great horned owl. Except the Eurasian eagle owl,
Which we don't happen to have.
which we won't see here, but that is the Eurasian eagle owl is a great horned owl on steroids, and